So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today there's a lot to cover. So, inshallah, we need to put in that focus. And here we go. And we're going to be doing this ayah, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ. We already did the first portion of it. And we said, قُلْ and تعالوا, talked about this piece of it. ما حرم ربكم عليكم ألا تشركوا به شيئا. So we left off at ما حرم ربكم, and we said this was an informative clause and the most important basis whenever you would want to basically deliver Islam. The first foundation that you want to start with is basically Tawheed. And this is the main foundation that, of course, whether you're in governance or whether you're in teaching or whether you are in parenting, or even with your own self, if tawheed, in other words, the person's relationship with understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with understanding how they understand the foundation of their deen, if that is right there corrupt, then all the different discipline that you might want to put in terms of legislation is going to go out the window. The main foundation is basically Tawheed. That's why the Prophet ﷺ didn't come in and say, well, you know what? We recognize within our society, we've got infanticide, we've got a lot of injustice, we've got economical corruption, we've got, these kind of political abuse and all of the. No, he didn't come in to actually discuss and lay out whatever, I guess, whatever ideas and whatever theories or whatever legislation would be fit for that society to become a civilized society. He didn't start with that whatsoever. He said, you know what? We have to start out with recognizing first who we are as human beings, who created us, and what our purpose of life is. And that's that akhirah. Not until we recognize that are you going to be capable of utilizing and putting those potentials in where they belong to get to a certain purpose. And this is basically Tawheed. What is Tawheed all about? Tawheed is all about one, recognizing the essence of Allah Almighty, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in what his own divine attributes and names, and recognizing the different details that relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we're talking about ibadah, we're talking about worship, we're talking about submission, we're talking about recognizing that my duty as a human being and my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what are its dynamics? What does that look like? That's basically Tawheed. Recognizing who you are, recognizing who created you, recognizing the beginning of life, and recognizing the end of life and where this is going. This is Tawheed in a nutshell. Not until we have that in place are we really going to be getting anywhere with understanding how to get into all the different management, in whether we're speaking about solutions in our behaviors or solutions in our social problems or economical problems or political injustices or social injustice or whatever it is. It basically first starts with recognizing your purpose. If these people are not recognizing that that is their purpose, then their purpose is going to be one simple thing, which is to feed and maximize their own happiness, maximize their own interests, and maximize basically their own selfishness. Then to somehow convince them that they have to share, or that they have to be nice, or that they have to be acting in social justice, all of that is going to be blown in the air, because to them it's like, well, I mean, thanks for the theory. It sounds it sounds very rhetorical. Thank you very much, but I don't want to apply it. And not until the person recognizes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a Samir, is al-Basir, is Dhul Quwwat al-Mateen, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically has all the power, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, and He is Alimul Ghaib, He is the one that is Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar. Not until we recognize that are you going to be having this person act in, let's call it religious integrity, and act based on these legislations and put it into practice. This is key. This is extremely important. So when you look at the foundation of any da'wah, it actually starts with tawheed. And that's basically what is demonstrated in, certainly in this ayah, in letting us know that tawheed is the foundation before you present all the different ideas or the different legislations or perhaps the different recommendations on how to cure and how to change the society. Okay, let's continue. So, أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Let's continue right there. And we basically looked at, we left off at this one. ذكر ابن المبارك. Ibn al-Mubarak basically, he's actually a known scholar, and he was also known for his commitment to tazkiyah. What did he say? So he basically had mentioned that Isa ibn Umar ibn Amr, sorry, ibn Murrah, that he told them that he was sitting with Rabi' ibn Khuthaym, and he was sitting with this person, and he said, would you want me, or would you want to be given kind of like a manuscript or a written document that basically had not been لم يفك خاتمها. لم يفك خاتمها. It's like, people don't really recognize of its importance. When that's more of an idiom to say, it says that its seal was not yet opened, okay? But this isn't necessarily to tell you, there's this sealed document, no one ever opened it before, but this is more of an idiom or a metaphor to say that this is such an important document, such an important piece of education that many people are totally unaware of. That's basically what this means. Okay, and he said, yes, what is it? And he said, well, I want you to read قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ, which is basically this ayah. And he read basically all this ayah. And it wasn't just this ayah, of course, because the ayah that follows it is up until ثُمَّ آتَيْنَا مُوسَى الْكِتَابَ تَمَامًا عَلَى الَّذِي أَحْسَنَ وَتَفْصِيلًا. Up until here, it basically has what is considered as the Ten Commandments that was revealed onto Prophet Musa, or even the Ten Commandments that were confirmed in the Old Testament. And now the Quran is coming in with the same idea of the Ten Commandments, which is not to associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to steal, not to commit zina, etc., all these different things. The same exact thing. So when you look at the foundation throughout history, this was the key thing to learn. This was the key thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent throughout the prophets and the messengers. And that's why Ka'b al-Ahbar, let me just give you an idea about Ka'b al-Ahbar. Ka'b al-Ahbar was a Jewish rabbi, okay? He was a Jewish rabbi, and then when he had become Muslim, being a Jewish rabbi, let me just give you an idea about the rabbinical life and what does that really mean. For rabbis, or for the Jewish religion, they spend hours, and I mean hours, in staying in the yeshiva. What is the yeshiva? Yeshiva is basically the religious school for Jews. And in the yeshiva, they would spend from early times in the morning up until almost 11 o'clock. Then they go for like a lunch break. Okay. And then they would come back, and then they would stay in the yeshiva until almost 4 p.m. And then they would go for a little break again. And then they would come back, and then come back to the yeshiva and basically continue studying up until almost 10 p.m. this is the amount of time that they would spend in studying in yeshiva, in the yeshivas. And of course, when we're talking about the rabbis and the amount of time that they would spend to learn, whether it's the Mishnah or whether Talmud or Torah, and the amount of time, of course, this is exclusive to men. Women do not join the yeshivas. In fact, it's considered as harmful to teach women the yeshivas and to teach women to teach women in yeshivas. Only the Reformed Jews consider that that is permissible for women to study basically the rabbinical studies, or to become rabbis, or to become basically the ones to teach the Torah or anything of that sort. So they would just learn some couple things. There are, of course, there are yeshivas for the younger girls, but at a certain age, they basically would graduate and then they get married and basically move on. So they don't become basically rabbis, at least in the Orthodox Jews. Okay. So when you look at Ka'b al-Ahbar, you're talking about this person that has a rich history in joining all these rabbinical studies and all these yeshivas, and and certainly Ka'b al-Ahbar, when he had become Muslim, there was a lot of information that he basically had known within Judaism, that he started basically sharing it right there. Let's say right there. And by the way, although, he was labeled as Ka'b al-Ahbar, when you go over and do a research on the quotations that Ka'b al-Ahbar had said in regards to Judaism, you really come out with two things. Number one is that perhaps he wasn't necessarily a rabbi per se. He had a lot of information, but not necessarily a rabbi. Why was he called al-Habr? I mean, just remember, even within the rabbinical institutions, there are certain rabbis, think of it as an imam. You've got an imam, you've got a mujtahid, you've got a faqih, you've got, people that would go up the ladder of how much they know. But it seems that when you go over what Ka'b al-Ahbar was saying in regards to the Torah and certain things about Judaism, some of it's either that it was true during Judaism during that time, or he wasn't necessarily as let's say educated or within the highest level of rabbinical education. Because some of the things that were claimed that Ka'b al-Ahbar had said in regards to the Torah, or in regards to the Talmud or Mishnah or whatever it is, that you did with research, you discover that it's actually not there in what resources we have today. That's one thing. Number two, it could be a poor narration from those that had transmitted this piece of information. Let me give you an idea or an example. Most Muslims are really not aware of the different resources that Jews would go to. They would just know Torah and Talmud, but all the other books in the Talmud, or perhaps the other resources that they might go and consider as resources on their own legislation, that they just say, this is what Torah says, but it wasn't necessarily in the Torah. But it was probably perhaps maybe in the Talmud or the Mishnah or whatever it is. And then of course that would be a poor attribution or a poor transmission, at least from the person that had quoted the quote. But it isn't necessarily that Ka'b al-Ahbar himself was not a scholar. he could have been a scholar, at least in rabbinical studies, but not necessarily at the highest level, or maybe he was. And our possibilities, in other words, we're talking about a number of different hypotheses. It's either that he wasn't necessarily at the highest level of his rabbinical education, or it was a poor transmission from the people that had basically taken the ilm from Ka'b al-Ahbar, and they said, well, this is what we know of Judaism. And they just said, well, the Torah says, when it's not necessarily the Torah, but it's probably Talmud or probably the Mishnah or probably, so this is the other hypothesis. Or number three, that he was just a random person from the Jewish society that became Muslim, but because he was bringing in some information from his previous heritage or from his previous culture, that he was basically seen, or by the Muslims, that they were the ones to label him and to give him the description as a habr, and that he wasn't necessarily a rabbi himself, but I guess the Muslims maybe had given him this description as a way of respect, or as also an honor that he had become Muslim, and he was, think of it as a hyperbole, that since this is the person that had chosen to embrace the faith of Islam, this is the smartest of them, and therefore we'll call him Ka'b al-Ahbar. This is a possibility. This is a possibility, but all of these areas are what, all those hypotheses are definitely possible. I do not really know all the different resources on Judaism. I did used to teach at the Swedish Theological Institute. We did have a lot of Jews, and we did have, well, there were Reformed Jews, and they did have access to the Torah studies or even the Talmud, etc. It is available, but certainly I do recognize that the translation is not similar to having the actual wording itself. And I do also recognize that the language that the Torah, the Talmud, that it was written in was basically ancient Hebrew, that modern Hebrew is not the same. And therefore, let's call it the exact interpretation, the exact education about Jewish scriptures that we may see Ka'b al-Ahbar saying that it basically exists in Judaism may not always be very accurate. So right there, he basically wanted to say that this is the beginning of the Torah, and he said it's the beginning of Torah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. That this is the beginning of Torah, but that's not actually what we see in Genesis. That's not what it says. Okay? In Genesis, you start the Torah when it basically would start with telling us about the creation of the world, and basically telling us that God created everything, and basically telling us the story of that. So when he says that this is the prelude, or this is the beginning of the beginning of the Torah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. You would say, well, that's not what we actually have in resources, but that's why I let us get that hypothesis laid out right there, in order to understand, well, how did Ka'b al-Ahbar quote something that is not necessarily the truth of what we have in scripture, at least, or what we have currently in scripture. Okay, let's see. Ibn Abbas had said that this ayah is muhkama. What's the opposite of muhkama? Mansukh. Okay, what does that even mean? So il-mansukh means abrogated, meaning that the legislation, not the information, you do not abrogate information, because a fact is a fact. There's no change in facts. Okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us for tawheed. This is a fact. Okay, this is not a legislation. It doesn't change. Okay. Having that being said, when you talk about abrogation, we're talking about legislation. Of course, deny the Houthis deny the Jews basically deny that there's anything that was abrogated in Islam. No, we consider that that's a form of evolution that happened to legislation based on what suited a certain society, and therefore the different legislation that probably had come on perhaps maybe Bani Israel or maybe different nations that we probably would know that this is actually true. Okay, but do we necessarily adopt it as our own legislation? It's a whole debate between scholars. But Ibn Abbas wanted to get to that this ayah is muhkama, and therefore it's informative. It is not abrogated. This is basically something that was never changed throughout history. And this ayah was never whatsoever abrogated in any shape or form, whether through hadith or whether through Quran, to basically say, well, they were going to put a restriction right there or there are exceptions right there, etc. That this ayah is muhkama, meaning it's a comprehensive statement with all the details that are mentioned in it have never been changed. They had never been at all abrogated or been made exclusive to a certain time in history, etc. It basically is muhkama. And it was mentioned, of course, as part of, at least in Surah Al-Imran as well. And he said, أجمعت عليها شرائع الخلق. He said all the different legislations throughout history had unanimously agreed that this is basically a fact. And number one is a fact. Number two is a legislation that we have to abide by. And he said, وَلَمْ تُنْسَخْ قَطُّ فِي مِلَّةٍ. And it was never abrogated in any legislation whatsoever. And he said, and it was said that they're basically the 10 commandments that were revealed onto Prophet Musa alayhi salam. I want you to look at this one. When he said it was basically the 10 commandments, what do we see in the 10 commandments in at least the Torah, or perhaps confirmed by the New Testament in an ambiguous quote right there, that certainly all of that was basically mentioned in the 10 commandments with perhaps a different quoting, but the idea and the concepts are really generally the same. Okay, I could see somebody writing in the chat, but for some weird reason, I can't really see it. Hold on, what's going on? Okay, here we go. This is the goal. Okay, here we go. Right, so this is basically the goal of what we're trying to get to, at least in the 10 Commandments. Okay, let's see. Number 4, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And you would treat your parents in kindness. And of course, when you say بِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, remember, it's not based on your terms, but it's based on the terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and also their terms. So if your parent, basically to her, what's important is that you have a clean room, or what's important is that you, I guess, maybe wash the dishes or learn how to cook. This is what impresses your parent. This is birrul walidain. Okay, this would be birrul walidain, and therefore what may be considered as birrul walidain for parent A may not be the same that applies on parent B. Parent A expected her kids to not joke around in too much, or to consider certain adab and certain mannerisms. Then person B, who basically expected that, no, as long as, to me, what's more important is your studies, your homework, etc. This is more important to me than you working the house, etc. Then in that situation, follow the birrul walidain, even though I don't recommend basically the mother being the maid for her kids, and then the kids probably thinking that, you know what, I'll get my education and I'll basically impress her that way. I will say, parents, please have your children contribute and never see you as their maid. Guess what happens? If they continuously see you as their maid, you will be treated as the maid when you grow older, and you will not get the honor that you deserve. This is extremely important to keep in mind. Get the honor that you deserve by you yourself letting them know how to treat you even when they are young kids. Okay, let's see. وبالوالدين إحسانا. الإحسان إلى الوالدين برهما. What does it mean to do al-ihsan, or for the parents that it's ihsan? Ihsan is different than justice. Remember that one. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ, said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders in justice and in basically al-ihsan is the second level. So justice is when I give this much, you give this much. But Islam tells you that no, with the parents especially, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. Even if your parents at one point, they might have maybe abused you, maybe didn't do the right best thing in parenting, you as a child, you as at least their own child, at least, you have the responsibility to not necessarily, let's say, one, punish them for the wrong parenting, or perhaps maybe retaliate for whatever they had done when you were a child, but you have the responsibility to contribute in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered you to basically contribute in. So that's why I want you to look at this one. القرطبي said, وَحِفْظُهُمَا وَصِيَانَتُهُمَا, that what that means to be good to the parent is حِفْظُهُمَا. You take care of them. So what does that look like? You take care of them, whether you're taking care of their needs, their dunya needs, their health needs, their mental needs, their financial needs. All of that is basically meaning that you are taking care of them. So what does that even look like? So what that looks like is that you are contributing to basically give them the contribution that they had given you as well. And plus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked you to do in al-ihsan, even if they probably didn't contribute in a fair way. You basically live up to the principle that ihsan, not al-adl, but al-ihsan. Al-adl is probably something that may right now not be something that you can achieve once they grow older. Who knows what changes happened in their life and how they probably regret it, whatever it is. But for sure, they had a lot to contribute, and they had a lot of contribution that they had basically done in your life to basically make you who you are. So therefore, امتثال أمرهما. So therefore, being obedient to their orders is basically part of being a good, let's say, child or a good Muslim. إزالة الرق عنهما, freeing them from slavery. This is basically part of what Islam asks you to contribute in. وترك السلطنة عليهما. This needs a little stop right there. What does it mean? ترك السلطنة عليهما. Listen, your parents will always see you as their child. They will always see you as your baby, as their baby. That's the way that they'll always see. You could never parent your parent, even when they go wrong. Just understand, you can never parent your parent. That's why they won't even accept it from you, because to them, who are you to teach me? For them, they had always seen themselves as I'm the parent, I have the experience, I'm your teacher. Therefore, even if you might have surpassed me in your experience, in your education, whatever it is, you will always be as my child, and I will always be the parent. So don't attempt to take over the role of me as a parent, basically, in how they feel about this. So when you say تَرْكُ السَّلْطَنَةِ عَلَيْهِمَا, avoiding acting in hierarchy, I want you to use the word hierarchy because that's what a sultana means. When you say avoiding dealing with them in hierarchy, whether we're speaking about parenting them, or whether we're speaking about correcting them, or whether we're speaking about at one point thinking that you can somehow get into being authoritative. Mom, this is what you need to do. It's your fault, etc. Even if perhaps maybe it was her fault. Maybe you are right. But you have to avoid being in any position of parenting them or having some kind of an authority over them. And you have to put in basically that piece of that ayah when it basically said, وَاخْفِضْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ. What does that mean? وَاخْفِضْ لَهُمَا. الخفض means to lower. Janah means wings. When you look at the metaphor within this ayah, وَاخْفِضْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ. When you lay out your wings, or when a bird lays out their wings and puts their babies underneath their wings, and then what do? To keep them warm, to protect them perhaps from water, protect them maybe from the different predators, etc. All of that, that's now you are taking the other position. Now you are basically janah dhul. You are not taking that janah of protection, but you're doing janah dhul. You're coming in and you're laying out your wings, but you're being humble. Think of it as this bird that's coming in and basically curling their wings around them and bending down with dhul, bending down with as if you are basically prostrating, as if you are janah dhul. It's like you think of it as a bird that basically starts covering themselves up and bends down to their parents. That's a dhul. A dhul is a form of being humble. So what are you doing? You are basically just learning how to be just like a bird. Reduce speech, reduce trying to fly beyond them. It's okay. You may have the ability to fly and perhaps go up the ladder of so many different privileges and so many different opportunities that you might be getting. But Islam tells you, I don't want you going up. In a way, at least in your relationship with them, you have to وَخْفِضْ لَهُمَا. I want you to be humble. I want you, even when you converse with them, you're probably maybe a doctor, and your father or mother are these simple people that probably know nothing about medicine, but she comes in and starts to educate you on chamomile, I guess, flowers or whatever it is, and how that basically cures your stomach pain. And you're a doctor and you're like, actually, as a doctor and perhaps a GI doctor, mom, chamomile tea is probably not the best for every single person, but okay, thanks for the piece of information, but then I might need to then be humble and just pretend like I don't know. Pretend like I don't know and just give them this respect that I don't want to appear as if I'm parenting you, even when you're wrong. Even though I'm a doctor and specialized in GI, but you come to me with traditional medicine and telling me, hey, if only you were to drink fennel seeds, it's going to cure your stomach pain. If you were to combine ginger with lemon, with oil, with whatever it is, and you drink it, you're going to be just fine. All right? Your parents might come in with very, very, very traditional, uneducated methods. But then be careful and remember that without their contribution, you would not have gone far. If they didn't pay for your schooling, you would not have gotten here. If they did not give you the resources, you would have not made it. So therefore, when you get these tools, it's the highest peak of lacking mannerisms when someone gives you the resources to use, you start then using it to kill them. That's the worst kind of betrayal. Don't try to educate your parents. You can, it's okay to share it and say, here's what I recommend. Here's what you can do. Here are some things that I had learned. Mind if I share it? Respect. Appreciate them. Appreciating your parents is key, but to somehow key to Jannah, but to somehow make them feel like they are stupid, or they're so uneducated, or they don't deserve the honor, then we've got a big problem with that. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَخْفِضْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, what you need to do is really, like that bird, just embrace them. And embrace them with dhul, not parenting, not hierarchy, not coming up from above, but come in with dhulin, recognizing all the things that they had contributed in you. And this is tarku sultanati alayhima. Never deal with your parents in any type of hierarchy, even if you may be really having that hierarchy in your education and whatever it is, you have to learn how to be humble. Okay. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ. Do not kill your children with the motive of imlaq. What is imlaq? So imlaq is basically poverty. It says that right there. And is it really necessarily just poverty? Let's see, did they necessarily only used to kill their children in fear of poverty? I mean, what do you mean in fear of poverty? Well, you probably are making, let's say, this much amount, $3,000 a month, whatever, okay? And $3,000 is barely covering rent, insurance, probably food, daily expenses, all these different things, barely covering all the things that you need. So you basically probably decide, you know what? That's only enough for 3 people and a mother and a father. But now that there's another kid coming on the way, you know what? We can't afford to have another kid. So what should we do? Should we just end the pregnancy from the beginning, terminate the pregnancy, or perhaps when the baby is born, before we even create any affection, just kill them and just commit infanticide? Was this only done on boys or girls during the pre-prophetic era? So during the pre-prophetic era, why is that even important to talk about? Because we need to know the context of what this ayah was talking about. Because this ayah is coming in to correct a certain behavior, to correct a certain common tradition that they basically practiced. So what was the practice? Well, the practice was the girls, they were killing them or burying them alive or killing them. In fact, the woman, when she would get a baby, there would be a ditch, literally a ditch right underneath her. And once the baby is out, if it's a female girl, right away just put her in the ditch and just close it up. And that way we won't feel guilty about it. Right away, the baby's out, cut the umbilical cord, right away bury her, and we're all done. Okay, that was one method. The second method is even when she grows older, their motive was to protect these girls or protect at least the family honor. This is what they considered. That's why they called it honor killing. In Islam, this is not honor killing. This is lack of honor killing. This is what it is. So when you look at that motive, their motive was, well, we don't want this girl to one day perhaps become promiscuous, or perhaps even later maybe want to get married, and then she ends up taking some of what we had contributed in her, or perhaps some of the wealth, and then give it to another family. So what they had seen in girls is that they're a disgrace to the family in what they might commit in the future by being promiscuous or maybe abused by someone else, or perhaps maybe whatever contribution that it's going to go for another family and not our family. So what would they do? They would see the girls as a disgrace, and therefore they would bury them before they even take any decision. Okay. Now, that was one type, but that wasn't exclusive to that. But they also used to bury the boys or kill the boys alive as well as a type of sacrifice for the gods. Just like remember when Abu Talib or Abdul Muttalib, he basically wanted to sacrifice his own children and one of his children, because it was a culture at the time that if you had 10 children and above, that you have to be thankful to the gods for giving you these boys, and then you're going to sacrifice one of them. So that was the suggestion that their gurus or whatever, their uh, their um, their priests, they told him that, well, you have to sacrifice one of them. So he would make a draw, and the draw would come up with the name of Prophet Muhammad Muhammad's father to basically be the person that he would sacrifice. Make the draw a couple times, and it was always coming up with his name. So that's when he goes back to these priests or gurus or whatever it is, and they suggested that he would donate 100 camels if he did not want to apply the God's wishes, quote unquote. All right. So that was one other reason. But the other reason why they might kill boys or girls was in fear of poverty. They considered, well, we've got a certain amount of income. This income is only good to supply these number of people. So therefore, if we get another person, then and we cannot afford to basically share these resources with this new person, then therefore the best option is to kill them or sell them, because they used to see their own children as basically their own property. So then the ayah basically says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ. And by the way, selling your own children or killing their own children was something that was not only a practice in the pagan Arab culture, but it was a culture that was practiced in multiple areas around the world, because they had seen that children were their own property, and it was a way to bring in income. So they would sell their own children. I was really surprised to see that, I was watching a documentary the other day, sorry, not today, but the other day, and there was a documentary on children being sold in Malaysia on social media for being dark-skinned. I was really surprised. I don't know if those are random, very random cases. I'm sure it's illegal. I don't know how this happens to happen. I don't know which society that is. Being here in Malaysia, I don't even know all the different areas. I went to Terengganu. I felt like I was in a completely different world in Malaysia. People didn't understand English. Their appearance looked completely different than the people here. So I'm not really sure if they're different races, different groups of people, but it seems like I still need to educate myself. But this documentary was covering that. So until the time of today, there are people that actually sell their own children in fear of poverty, or even in fear of, yes, this child is black, this child is dark, therefore, why should we care about him? We need to basically just give him away. So it's just so scary how, the Western influence had made people see that the whiter you are, the more privileged, the smarter, the better, the more human you are, and therefore the darker you are, the less human, the less in well, I mean the less in your intelligence, and certainly demonizing people or even giving people privileges based on the color of their skin. This is just so shocking, but yes, this is something that exists until today, believe it or not. Okay, so when it said here al-imlaq, so the first opinion basically said, well, this is talking about those that had feared poverty, and out of that fear of poverty, they basically had give up on their children, kill their children, slaughter their children, whatever it is. At the end, this is a form of qatl. So whether il-qatl to literally mean killing, like as infanticide, or whether il-qatl to basically disregard or just abandon this child, that's a form of qatl as well. So whether the motive was poverty or whether it was exclusive to basically infanticide, killing girls in childhood, as in fear of disgrace, then in that situation, that would still be included within this one. So وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ, it's a more comprehensive word. Do not kill your children. And it's not exclusive to girls or boys. And now we see that it was a culture of that was practiced against girls and boys, and not necessarily just girls. But I guess, girls, it was more common than killing boys, because boys were seen in a primitive society as perhaps in the future they were going to be, if they were strong, they were if they were strong, they were going to be basically trained in, some type of a military training to basically defend the family. If they basically had a different kind of an strength, they were to be working in the fields, probably maybe even running a business, etc. So now they were capable of generating money. So they basically saw boys as, hey, this is something that will generate money in the future. This is somebody that will give us protection. This is basically a great asset. But for girls, they had seen that they were not a good asset, but they were going to be eating up their income because they're going to be dependent on basically the family members and not independents, and therefore they were going to be a burden. So they had seen the girls as a burden, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically commented as a rejection to their behavior and said, وَنَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ. We give you the provisions, and we will give them the provisions. In other words, just like you basically got the provision, they'll come in with their provision, their rizq, their food, their water, and their resources. So don't worry about that. There's a certain provision. And it's quite interesting, marriage, okay? Marriage or even having children. The children, they will come with their rizq. The children will come with their rizq. Don't worry about, well, we don't have the good income. You will see the blessings basically bringing in the rizq without you realizing. Every single child comes with a rizq. Same thing, we're talking about marriage. When you get married, the wife will bring in rizq unless she wanders the money. But the wife will also come in with rizq without you realizing. All right. And of course, let's look at this one. He said, and they used to do that is basically kill the boys and the girls in fear of poverty, as to what basically the statement appears to basically let us know in terms of this ayah. So ظاهر الآية. ظاهر الآية, in other words, just basically from the surface interpretation, from the surface recitation, we know that they certainly did kill boys and girls, and that wasn't exclusive against girls. Okay, now let's look at it here. So when you look at the root of the word, al-imlaq, where does that word come from? And here he says, al-ju'u bi-lughati lakhm. Let me just explain this. Well, what do you mean bi-lughati lakhm? Who's lakhm? Okay, so the Arab tribes in the Arabic language, in every single language, they would basically do somewhat of an influence upon one another. So you will see, for example, certain English words that go back whether to perhaps the etymology, Arabic, Latin, Greek, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so when you look at that, for example, cup in Lugha Arabiya, kub, all right, and the list goes on and on. It's not just with cup, all right. When you look at a lot of the Semitic languages, why am I speaking about Semitic languages? You're talking about Syriac, not Syrian accent. I'm not talking about Syria. I'm talking about Syriac. You talk about perhaps maybe certain Armenian. You're talking about certain certain Semitic languages, Hebrew, etc. You will see that they basically have, whether in the sound or what is called the nahl, there's a slight stress, there's a slight variant, but it really sounds the same. I'll give you an example. In Lugha Arabiya, we say واحد, اثنان, ثلاثة. In Hebrew, أحد, شتايم, شلوش. Let's continue. أربعة, خمش. أربعة, خمسة. Okay? Now, when you look at that, this is just, we're still just counting to 5. I still didn't go to the 30 and 20. I still didn't get anywhere. Okay? Same thing when you were to look at, for example, I ate. أني أخلتي. In Arabic, أنا أكلت. أتا أخلتا. أتم أخلتم. You ate, they ate, أنتم أكلتم. أنحن, same thing. You would say that there's a lot of similarity. There are a lot of similarities. There's a lot that basically traces back to one another. So when he says al-imlaqu al-ju'u bilughati lakhm, in Lugha Arabiya, in the Quran, in the Quran, we do have a lot of words that may be originating from a certain tribe. Maybe this is or perhaps even languages. So you will see certain words that come from Habashi, or at least from Ethiopia, certain words that may come from Ja'ziya, or certain words that may come from maybe Hebrew, or certain words that may come this. But of course, when you're talking about language, this is not at all putting the Lugha Arabiya down, or because the Quran basically says, Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyya. The Quran says that this is Arabic. Well, if it says that this is Arabic, how did you come up with the claim that certain words are Ja'zi, or certain words are Aramaic, or certain words are Hebrew, etc.? Well, what is al-Arabi? Al-Arabi itself, the Arabic language itself, it wasn't just born out of the blue. All languages, they adopt from one another. All languages, they adopt from one another. This basically becomes a vocabulary within this group of people. This becomes an adopted vocabulary. You start creating a new vocabulary introduction, and it becomes known within this group of people. So when you look at certain words that the Arab had used, they may even go back to perhaps maybe Ethiopia or maybe to Hebrew or whatever it is, but that's because geographically speaking, these were basically adjacent. They were close, and they basically did adopt, whether through business trade or whether through dealing with these people socially, etc., or whether the slaves coming in, all of these different things, it becomes a known word that people would use to identify certain ways of communication. Okay, so when we look at al-imlaq بمعنى الجوع بلغة لخم, this is not to mean that this is not an Arabic word, but it is a word used in certain Arabic tribes, and that Arabic tribe is basically the tribe of Lakhm, and this tribe of Lakhm, they used to use the word imlaq to mean hunger. Okay, and certainly the Quran used that word from a different tribe. Now, this is also to teach us one thing. It is not degrading to learn perhaps a different accent or even use certain words from different accents or whatever. It becomes something that basically an introduction in your own vocabulary, and it becomes something that is used within your terms. And of course, it becomes, I guess, an adopted. I'm basically speaking in Palestinian accent, and my husband speaks Tunisian accent, and then we basically right now have our own common common language that if I were to speak with the Palestinians, they'll pick up that there are certain sounds that a typical Palestinian would not do. Just a real Palestinian that was not influenced by others, they'll, from the first few minutes, they'll be looking at me and wondering where I come from, even though I'm Palestinian, but for sure I was influenced by a different accent. Same thing with my husband, who's Tunisian. He basically got influenced. But of course, this is not to put any of us down, because this is a wiring that happens not only in your brains, but this basically becomes this new introduction that we start adopting with one another, and we basically just start making a new language. If this is at a scale of a husband, wife, and children, how is it with a whole society? With a whole society, that's the same thing. When you start having perhaps massive migration from a certain society, you basically start seeing that there are new words that are introduced, different ways of communication, different ways of perhaps naming things, etc. And there's only one way, and which is that particular wording. The one that I see is really, sometimes I must admit, I don't understand why, but mouse is, you would see mouse, but then you would see the West, or at least banana, for example, English, is basically referring to the banana as well. All right. But Al-Quran calls it talh. Okay. And when you see that whole idea of mouse, and well, why did the word mouse happen? And why did the word banana, which basically is anything that is straight, just like your fingers. Okay, so just like your fingers, the Quran basically كلا بلا قادرين على أن نسوي banana. It's not talking about any bananas, but it's talking about your fingers. And a finger, or at least something that is an individual stretch, that's called a banana. Okay, or a banana. All right. So I'm really still trying to figure out why they had used a banana for a banana, but then we call it mouse, which is not necessarily Arabic word, or is it? So tell me what you end up basically finding, perhaps, just on a side, trying to tease you right there. All right, let's see. So at the end, regardless of whether it is to mean hunger based on the accent of lahm, or whether this was talking about a certain problem of spending. So regardless, of course, if you're going to be talking about income, you're talking about resources, you're talking about hunger, you're talking about limited resources, it basically goes within the same parameter. Whether we're speaking about expenses or whether we're speaking about hunger, you're talking about resources and their spending as well. So that basically goes within that parameter. Let's continue right there. And I want to get to the other part, and which is this point. This is a key point right there, which basically is referring to al-azl. What is al-azl? Al-azl, coitus interruptus. That's basically what it means. So what does that even mean? So when in intimacy, and when the man is about to basically go into the stage of ejaculation, in order to prevent pregnancy, would basically withdraw. Okay, that's what it is. Okay, now here's one thing, is that pregnancy does not necessarily happen only through that ejaculation only, because pregnancy, or at least certain sperms, may even travel to the prostate fluid even before that. So just to let you know, but at the end is that they considered that with their experience at least, they considered that what can be as a form of a contraceptive is to basically withdraw and to avoid pregnancy. Okay, now here's one thing. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that was the method that they used as a contraceptive. All right. And the scholars had conflicting resources on the ruling of that withdrawal, al-azl. You had some ahadith that said this was something that they had practiced in their personal life, and withdrawal was a method that they used to basically prevent pregnancy, and this being on such a behavior, they considered that that's our evidence to prove that that is permissible. That was their evidence. They said, here's our evidence that was being revealed. It didn't say that that was not permissible to use. It basically had not commented on it. The second opinion, they basically said, well, this actually falls within وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ. That's the second opinion. The second opinion said, well, this is a form of obstructing the birth or the pregnancy of a child, and therefore in fear of having more children. So you want to interrupt having more children because you feel that you cannot afford it, whether you cannot afford it financially or whether you cannot afford it physically. You are trying to interrupt or obstruct the possibility of getting a baby. And they said, well, in the second opinion, they said this is qatl al-awlad. And just because they had said that they were doing that, but no ayah had said that that was impermissible, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only evidence that we would know of. What is your evidence? Well, they said, well, we've got a hadith that basically said ذَلِكَ الْوَأْدُ الْخَفِيُّ. Let's see. So this is part of a hadith of Juthama bint Wahab. You could see the hadith is narrated by Muslim, hadith narrated by Ahmad right there, and that the Prophet ﷺ had basically called it al-wa'dul khafi, the hidden infanticide. Hidden infanticide. So if you hidden infanticide, but the baby is not even born yet. but he called it the hidden infanticide. In other words, you are obstructing the birth of a child in a hidden way. You're manipulating the flow of nature, basically. So called it al-wa'd al-khafi. Now, here's one thing. Then they debated, well, what really is this hidden infanticide that was referred to in this hadith? One, is it referring to that withdrawal? Or is it referred to al-wa'd al-khafi, perhaps different methods that they might be using to basically prevent pregnancy or perhaps kill the child? What really was this referring to? Is this necessarily? Then they go into another type of a different opinion between them on how to interpret it. Is this basically saying that this is makruh, therefore hated? Or is this telling us that this is basically haram, meaning that you will be held accountable, you're at sin for doing it? Two different things. If you're saying that this is makruh, then I'm not held accountable. And that it's not the preferred option, but you're not held accountable for it. We would prefer that you not withdraw, but it's hated. We prefer that you don't do it. But if you were to say it's haram, that would mean that this is basically a sin one would be committing. And guess what? Both opinions are valid opinions. Let's say another group of scholars, they said, well, no, it's not makruh and it's not haram either, but it's actually permissible. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, لا عليكم ألا تفعلوا فإنما هو القدر. And he said, well, there's nothing wrong if you were to do that. And you could say this hadith is narrated by Muslim, narrated by Bukhari. And he said, well, there's la alaykum, meaning that you're not held accountable. There's no sin upon you. And at the end, فَإِنَّمَا هُوَ الْقَدَرُ. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically, or had predestined something is going to happen. Just you doing that is not going to change the truth of the matter of what destiny and what actually happens. In other words, it's okay if you want to do that, but just know that by you doing that, that is, by you doing that, that you're not necessarily avoiding pregnancy, and that pregnancy might still be destined to happen, even perhaps with prosthetic fluid at the end. So therefore, there's no sin upon you for doing that withdrawal. And this is basically what some of the scholars have basically understood. But here's one thing. I mean, with withdrawal, you could see that there are differences of opinions between scholars just on the whole idea, whether this does fit within the definition of وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ, do not kill your children. So you had, is this referring all the way to something as, let's say, before even the baby is made? Before a baby or before any fertilized egg even happens. We're just talking about a fluid right now. Okay, contains sperms, etc., but these things are not yet living creatures, at least, well, I mean, not yet, having mother and father together of their chromosomes. I know we see them under the microscope moving and all about, all right? But it's still not considered necessarily as a living creature yet. It doesn't have the ruh. It doesn't have the mother and father combination to make it a living creature. Well, that takes us to the other question. Contraceptives. Are contraceptives halal or haram? So let me just clarify. Number one is that you had the first opinion. I'm going to lay out the first opinion first, or the different opinions. The first opinion said it's haram. Why? Well, they said, just like the withdrawal is haram, then we're going to say that this is a form of al-wa'd al-khafi. This is a form of basically that hidden infanticide. That was the first opinion. It's haram. The second opinion said, well, it's hated unless you had a medical reason or perhaps maybe a social reason, etc. The mother was too tired. She was, trying to focus on her kids' education or whatever it is. So it basically said, you know what, I'm going to space out the kids. The second opinion basically said, well, I mean, we would hate it that you would do that, but that's permissible, or at least you won't be held accountable. You're not held accountable, meaning you're not at sin for it. The third opinion basically said, well, at the end, look at this hadith. It basically said, لا عليكم ألا تفعلوا فإنما هو القدر. It, at the end, لا عليكم ألا تفعلوا. It's like, if you want to do it, go ahead. At the end, you just got to know that you can't really change what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had meant that this child get born and that there would be a child that was born, even if you had put the IUD, that's not going to necessarily obstruct it. I mean, certainly we know in science, that certain things, are sent into your brain depending on the type of IUD or whatever it is. And that definitely we already know that it at least reduces the chances of getting pregnant. We can, simple math, we can get 100 women, give them IUDs or give them perhaps maybe contraceptives, and the possibility of these women getting pregnant is definitely going to be, yes, it's a possibility, 2%, 3%, 5, 20, etc. But it depending on the type of contraceptive and how, let's say, accurate they take it, or maybe their bodies as well. But at the end, it can fail, at least with a small percentage. But the other ones, we're going to see that they were fertile. These 100 women, no contraceptive was used, and therefore we're going to have an amount of women, a number of women perhaps that are barren, don't get any children, infertile, and basically that, of course, but certainly we're going to say the chances are most of these women are, at least if they're within the right age, within the right fertility, etc., most of them are going to get pregnant. Okay. Now, having that being said, when you're looking for إنما هو القدر. Now, the second part of the debate. So now we see that some scholars said that contraceptives are haram, makruh, and mubah. Other scholars, well, at least within this debate, other scholars, they wanted to actually research the type of contraceptive used. So what does that look like? Or what about IUDs? What about patches? What about pills? What about these things that you would insert under the skin? All of these different methods. Regardless of the different method, if for the scholars that said it was makruh, or the scholars that said it was permissible, hated or permissible, they looked into the type and then they debated certain methods. The method that was debated, things like the Marina IUD, that was debated. Certain patches or certain, basically these under the skin that they would basically insert, they debated. Let me explain the debate. So when you look at, for example, the Paragard IUD and the Marina IUD, the way that they work is completely different. The Marina one, it basically would allow fertilization to happen, but before it goes into the implantation, before it gets implanted in the uterus, it basically releases it. Okay. So, but the Paragard, no, it basically does not even allow the space to even have the fertility happen from the start. Okay. So the scholars that said it was permissible or makruh, they debated on well, is it necessarily considered as a form of abortion if we are to allow for that fertilization to happen, but then before the implantation actually happens, we basically drop it? Is that a form of abortion or is it not? And that was one piece of the debate. And same thing if we're talking about different methods as well, they fall within the same debate. When and how does it actually prevent pregnancy? Some contraceptive pills basically sends a message to your brain by elevating a certain hormone, basically, and your brain starts getting into believing that that, hey, you are actually pregnant, and hey, no need to release these eggs or whatever it is. And then it becomes basically a way that we would manipulate the brain that, hey, she's actually pregnant. And that way you won't get pregnant because as a mammal, or of course, we cannot get pregnant over a pregnancy. Our body is only capable of taking one pregnancy. So just to let you know, I mean, put you within this picture. Now, when we're speaking about what is the preponderant is wallahu a'lam. If we're talking about uh, a pregnancy that is spaced out, or we're speaking about a pregnancy or at least a pregnancy, contraceptive that your OB looked into your case and said, well, for your case, this is the right method for you to space out pregnancies, etc. And doing, I guess, running the tests. So, they do some tests on your breasts and some tests on your hormones and test different things. And some people, they can't handle estrogen, and others, they can't handle this, and just different things. So as long as you take the necessary precaution, because لا ضرر ولا ضرار, we want to make sure that you stay healthy. So you basically see your OB to make sure that it's safe for you to take this, and then therefore you can take it. But here's the other thing. Number 3, what if I don't want to get children? Can I, what is called tying the tubes, basically, or removing the ovaries? Okay, at one point, they used to encourage women to remove the ovaries once they're 40, and they were telling them that, hey, this decreases your chance of getting, I guess, ovarian cancer or whatever it is. But then they discovered later that, hey, the ovaries actually have more than just getting babies. Ovaries have a number of different things that actually regulate certain things even in your brain, certain things even on your body, even in different things. So when you're talking about ovaries, it's not just responsible for having babies, but it actually has a bigger responsibility and a bigger, completely different function than just getting babies. Anyhow, regardless of all of that. So tying the tubes in Islam, any form of changing your creation, whether you're taking out, I don't know, a kidney, a liver, tying the tubes or what, this bringing in an induced dysfunction into any part of the body is haram, because your body is an amana. It's a trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So tying the tubes would only be permissible if there was a medical reason or a life-threatening reason, that if you were to get pregnant and no other method was basically right for you, we're talking about contraceptives, no other method was right for you, and the only way to do this is by perhaps permanently disabling you from getting children, like the tying tubes, etc., then that would be permissible only in cases where the alternative was probably more dangerous on your health. In other words, only if you had a health risk reason are you capable of bringing in a permanent contraceptive. Only if your health was at risk. That's it. So like what? Like, for example, you might have a disease and there's a certain medication that you need to take. I know I had a case, she had this disease and she was supposed to be on a pill that's a chemotherapy. It's a form of chemotherapy, and she had to take it for the rest of her life. And if she were to get pregnant, for sure the child was going to be not only disabled, but we're talking about maybe a child born with no head, with no heart, with no limbs, these different, I mean, a severe deformity. So they said that she has to basically be permanently terminated from getting children because there is a direct correlation between children born with these deformities and mothers using these types of medications. This is right there. What if she doesn't take this medication? She doesn't take this medication, she's basically, it could be fatal and it could be something that she could be risking her life in. So therefore, recognizing all those different circumstances that some may be in is part of that fatwa. So just putting you within this area. Let's see. The Prophet ﷺ had basically said, وَإِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ خَلْقَ شَيْءٍ لَمْ يَمْنَعَهُ شَيْءٍ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had willed that something would be created, nothing would prevent it. You could see right here, narrated by Muslim. So that's basically to support that other opinion that tells you, well, you know what, even if you were to put a contraceptive, even if you were to do this, certainly the probability is less, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that He controls different things in nature. Here, I want you to look at this one. قال مالك والشافعي لا يجوز العزل عن الحرة إلا بإذنها. وكأنها امرأة والإنزال من تمام لذتها. This is actually scientifically proven. Let me explain what this is saying. Malik and the Shafi'i, they said withdraw on a free woman is not permissible without her permission because, he explains, that they had seen that not withdrawing is actually getting her in, or at least the wife, to having her utmost, I guess, pleasure, and that she would have the right to have children, but they didn't necessarily see the same as being the right for a bondswoman, and therefore they considered that he is permitted to basically do that withdrawal. Let me explain this one. This is actually scientifically proven that there are certain amino acids, and there are certain basically proteins and certain things within certainly the fluid that does actually affect a woman, and it basically contains antidepressants as well for the woman. So when we're talking about, at least the way they would explain it in simple terms that way, but then, I'm not a doctor to explain this, but studies are definitely speaking of a certain correlation between these proteins basically in not withdrawing and its impact on the woman's health and the woman's mental health and all these different things. So it's quite interesting that Malik and the Shafi'i, they were extremely smart to even recognize, even before knowing the impact in terms of how we would say in protein and all of that, and what science would tell us today. They basically had seen with their experience, or perhaps maybe with other scholars, it was something that was known, that there is something that women would say, that there is a certain correlation between not withdrawing and between their mental health, or even between their right. So just wanted to let you know and just see this point right there. And subhanAllah, I guess it helps us see that scholars were not separate in educating in educating about what women, or even understanding women's rights even in sexual health. I just want you to see that one. So the Arab, the fuqaha, they were not blind and they were not deaf, and women would share perhaps what they were feeling. And that's why even in the books of fiqh, they would say, well, this is part of her sexual right, basically. When they go that far and say, min وَكَأَنَّهُمْ رَأَوُا الْإِنزَالَ مِنْ تَمَامِ لَذَّتِهَا. It's quite interesting that the fuqaha, even though you could say they were all male fuqaha, but they were also advocating for women's sexual health. All right. It's quite interesting. Inshallah, we'll continue, but there's Salat al-Jumu'ah. Is tubal ligation? Well, I was just talking about tubal ligation. Well, tubal ligation in general. If we're talking about basically using these different methods to get kids, okay? To get kids. Scholars actually had differences of opinions on tubal ligation, and we're talking about the IVF as well, okay? It is within the area of differences of opinions between scholars. Opinion one basically considered that is haram, and they were looking at it from the angle that it is not a necessity to uncover the aura from. That was their defense. The second opinion said it was permissible because whether getting children or whether seeking treatment in general, this is considered as a problem, and we are permitted to seek whether you've got an infection or whether you have a scar or something like that, just like you can seek treatment. And even if it involved your private area, well, you can also seek treatment if there is to basically get pregnant as well and have children. So if it is with between the relationship of a husband and a wife, IVF, majority of the scholars, at least majority of the modern scholars, they consider that that is permissible. Okay, let's see. The sister is saying cutting out of body or adding meaning, filling is the same in Islam. Right. So whether you're, preventing pregnancy or whether you're adding, is it necessarily the same way in how they scrutinize the matter? Not necessarily. They didn't scrutinize it the same way. Like you could say that when they said it was haram, at least to do IVF, at least those scholars that said it was haram to do IVF, they considered that it's revealing the aura for unnecessary reasons. The other scholars, they said, well, why would you say it's haram? It's a form of treatment. If we have the method to treat this and to get this couple, whether the treatment meant giving them certain medications to, I don't know, perhaps maybe increase ovulation for the woman, etc., then in that situation, are we considering that as haram? Or whether it's using perhaps a different method, which is IVF. All right. So is that going to be haram? Then, well, it's not going to be right there, that researched in the same way that they would research basically the withdrawal or abortion or basically contraceptives and preventing pregnancies. This is basically, of course, a short discussion, very short. This was extremely short, okay? But because of Salat al-Jumu'ah, I have to end right here. Inshallah, tomorrow we're going to continue with fiqh of marriage. Inshallah, we're at point 7. So stay tuned with our tafsir. If there are any questions before we end, go ahead. I would love to hear your questions or even comment. No one wants to say anything. Everybody is shy from the topic. Well, I'm the one that should be shy because I really went in details. But go ahead, Ustaz Umayya.
Bismillah. You mentioned something about that not permissible for Muslim to cut any part of his body because it's not belong to him. Uh, and we know that some people they adjust the what Allah created, like filling the lips, filling, doing something. It's not natural. Is it the same when you cut
Okay,
off
fair
his
enough.
stomach?
No, that one is actually changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not coming in with the same thing. Changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala,
Mm.
putting in fillers and putting in, I guess, injections to change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's haram.
So it's from the
Right?
مغيرات لخلق الله.
Oh,
He said,
absolutely. It's changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
okay.
And I would add that it's not just from the angle of changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's also that we know right now that these things are harmful things. So the companies, the cosmetic companies, they're introducing it like, hey, you're struggling with this fat, here's what we can have. We can give you this Ozempic, everything's going to be fine, just a couple of injections, and then the fat is going to be gone. You're just going to be fit and looking great and all of that stuff. And then if, for example, the cosmetic companies are presenting it that it is free of side effects, but we are seeing a number of different side effects right now that I would say those companies are trying to silence. Those companies are trying to silence the truth of the matter of these side effects, and girls are running after them like there's no side effects. But we know that Islam tells you, la darar wa la darar. You're not supposed to be harming yourself. And therefore, if there was a government, if there was a Muslim government, it would actually mandate that people that do this would expose these dangerous side effects, side effect in cancers, and all these different side effects, and basically expose it right there in order to warn people from all this. That's number one. Number two is that in general, changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unless there was a medical deformity. So what does that look like? We're talking about a person maybe having, um, hey, they had a car crash, and as a result, their job, they had a completely, broken jaw, and in order to replace all of that, she needs to basically get a replacement. Or let's say she had cancer, needed to do mastectomy, needed to basically rejuvenate and do all of that, and they'll take some of the skin from the hips or whatever it is and basically put it up there in order to grow and all of that, or probably put in silicone pads or whatever, balls or whatever, these things, in order to basically give it a nice aesthetic look, etc., or at least a normal look. So in that situation, that would be permissible if there was a medical deformity. But if there was no medical deformity and it's just basically trying to stay up somehow to a certain standard of what the society thinks makes beauty, then in that way it would be haram. What if my husband wanted me to do that? Even if your husband wanted you to do that, because لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. There's no obedience to anybody in disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Changing khalq Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said that the shaitan was going to use on human beings in order to control them from within. What does he do? Well, he controls them from their outside. And that's why we're seeing more women basically run after these fake appearances, because it's distracting them from focusing on their inner appearance. Hasina, go ahead, dear.
Sheikha, is Botox the same?
Botox is the same, yes, dear. Unless it was
Seriously?
used, Botox is the same. So whether you're talking about a filler, Botox, all these different kinds of injections, okay, unless there was a deformity. Okay, a deformity. Let's say, hey, she's got all these veins and varicose veins or whatever it is, and spider veins and all of that as a result of this is a deformity. She wanted to use Botox to basically prevent her from, even though the Botox goes away and you would have to keep on doing it every couple months. Okay, but at the end of the day, is that, if it's a deformity, you could use it, but and it's permissible. But if it's not a deformity, whether it's called Botox or whether it's called filler or whether it's called pumping and puffing and all of these different things and Brazilian or whether no matter what it was called, it would be not permissible unless there was a real deformity. Islam wanted you to basically look within and not necessarily focus on your appearance. Islam wanted you to stay healthy. And this is being healthy, because we are seeing right now an increase in the statistics in cancer and different kinds of basically deformities, because of course you're going to have to keep on doing these fillers each and every single time, every single I guess amount of while, and then you're going to end up really ruining your body, ruining your image. Islam wanted you, hey, I want you to be confident in your beauty. I want you to be confident and not end up really just getting lost and becoming somebody else's product. Islam wanted you to be confident. Do not be somebody else's product. Isn't permissible to use Gaza relief funds for awareness or advocacy campaigns to relate it to Gaza? Yes, it is, dear. Yes, it is. It is. But unless this was zakah money and the people that donated it for just for the cause of basically using it for the food and the water and, those resources, then it would not be permissible to use it for basically creating awareness and campaigning for Gaza. Then it would be exclusive for just feeding and eating and using it for that way, not the campaign. Okay? And that's why it's really important to see like how much money is being used for the marketing, how much money is being used for, I guess, paying the employees, how much money is used for maybe the whole thing about food and water, and really paying it for what it was basically collected for. All right, so this is it. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله